I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Library, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. In particular, I want to welcome Ambassador and Lady Sheinwald, who have just arrived from Houston and are utterly relieved to be out of Washington, D.C., which is being inundated by snow. As much as I'm sure they want to be here, I'm sure they're all the more delighted to be here given the weather conditions back east. And we're delighted to have you. Tonight's program, Afghanistan and Pakistan, the UK Perspective, is sponsored by the LBJ Library and the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. The Strauss Center promotes research and discussion on the pressing challenges created by our increasingly globalized world. Before I introduce Admiral Inman, who will in turn introduce the ambassador, I want to introduce several distinguished guests in attendance here tonight. And would you please stand as I introduce you? First, there's Paul Lynch, the Consul General at the British Consulate General in Houston. You might want to hold our applause because I have about 4 or 5 other people to go. Lady Selina Hastings, a distinguished British author currently doing research at the University of Texas. Colonel Philip Battaglia, Chief of Staff, 1st Cavalry Division, Fort Hood. Colonel Battaglia recently returned from Iraq, where he served alongside British troops. Major Peter Little, British Exchange Officer, 1st Cavalry Division, Fort Hood. Lucy Baines Johnson, President and Mrs. Johnson's daughter, and her husband, Ian Turpin. Don't think Lucy's arrived yet. Ambassador Greg Engel, the Associate Director at the Strauss Center at the LBJ School, who has served in a number of diplomatic posts, including Pakistan. And Harry Middleton, who was the director of this great institution for more than 30 years. Harry? I think we can applaud all of them now. Well, tonight, Ambassador Sheinwald is speaking publicly for the first time since the London Conference, which brought together British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, President Karzai of Afghanistan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and 65 representatives from countries across the world. Today's headlines about the new military push in southern Afghanistan illustrate just how important and topical tonight's discussion will be. There will be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions of the ambassador, and we ask that you write those questions on index cards who will be passed to you from Sarah and Laura, our representatives here, and Admiral Inman will sort through them and get to as many as he can. It's my pleasure to introduce the Admiral. Bobby Inman is the interim director of, or I should make that interim dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and is recognized as an expert on security and international affairs. He has served as the director of the National Security Agency, the deputy director of Central Intelligence, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Bobby Ray Inman.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank all of you for coming to this event. It's a great honor to introduce to you formally the UK ambassador to the U.S. Sir Nigel is a young man. He was born in 1953. His undergraduate academic education was at Oxford, and he went to the Foreign Office. Began with a brief exposure to problems with Japan, and then they posted him to Moscow. He came back from that to the Foreign Office, but he worked on a different problem, Zimbabwe, just at a time when the transition, Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. From there, back to the Foreign Office to really be on the Soviet desk, watch events. And then he took another turn in the direction of where things are going to go, and all of a sudden, I'm required to fall back on my memory. He went from working the Soviet desk at the Foreign Office to another strange capital, to the United States, where he had his first posting in the political section. From that, back to the Foreign Office to help on long-term policy planning. We know a critical role for any State Department Foreign Office. From there, attention shifted to the European Union. First at the Foreign Office and then representative in Brussels. From that, he came back to a daunting new assignment, 2003 to 2007, as the foreign policy and defense advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair. And the media tells us they became very close in that process, worked together extraordinarily closely. His actual assignment as the UK ambassador to the US was made just at the end of Prime Minister Blair's appointment, though he actually overlapped briefly and, of course, serves Prime Minister Brown in his current assignment, as well as Her Majesty the Queen. He's going to talk about Afghanistan and the current structure, but he's told us that when it comes time to questions, he's prepared to field distant topics that you're interested in asking him about. I will probably shuffle them to make sure we've gotten through the Afghanistan questions later, but please don't be bashful. All I ask is that you make your questions as legible as possible so I can get through them. Sir Nigel, please welcome our ambassador.
Admiral Inman, Director Updegrove, dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for inviting me, and thank you all very much for being here this evening. As a public servant myself for the last 33 years, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here and to salute past, present and future practitioners of public service whom the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs has helped to shape and will in the future help to shape for this country. I, in fact, am working very closely in Washington, and I'm sure he's not completely snowed in, with the former dean of this school, Jim Steinberg, now Deputy Secretary of State. And there's always been that very close relationship between British ambassadors and people in the State Department. There's a story of a Christmas party about 3 decades ago, which some of you may have heard. It was hosted by the Secretary of State at the State Department, and he asked the British, French, and Soviet ambassadors to write down on a piece of paper what they wanted, what they'd like most for Christmas. And then she wrote them down. The answers came in. And the first one was the answer of the French ambassador. And the French ambassador said that he wanted liberté, fraternité, égalité pour tout le monde cette année. Great, very inspiring. Then it was the Soviet ambassador, and she read out his statement, and his statement was that we demand the dictatorship of the proletariat and peaceful coexistence for everyone this year. It was at that point that the British ambassador got rather worried, as the Secretary of State read out the British ambassador's entry, and his one said, "I'd really like a very small box of milk chocolates this Christmas." So that's the practical British streak. My job is to continue to promote that practical relationship between the UK and the US. It's got an extraordinary history. We believe it's a modern partnership of purpose in so many areas, areas that I've been covering here today in Austin, in business, in culture, in politics. And of course, there's a great relationship and understanding between us. There's Churchill's great phrase, that you can always trust the Americans to do the right thing when they've exhausted all the alternatives. Texas has a long and proud tradition of providing servicemen and women for the US military. And I'm delighted to see Colonel Battaglia here this evening. As I speak, more than 35,000 troops from Texas-based units, including the Texas National Guard, are in Afghanistan, playing their part in the international coalition under General McChrystal. And over 10,000 British troops are fighting alongside them. Behind you, we are by far the second largest contributor to that effort. And between us, we share the heaviest burden and engage in the toughest fighting, mostly in the south and east of that country. Now, I pay tribute to the dedication and the bravery and the skill of our and other allied military and civilian personnel serving in Afghanistan. And our cooperation is embodied here today by Major Peter Little, who was mentioned before, who is the British liaison officer at Fort Hood, who has himself served a number of tours both in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, standing here in the Memorial Library of President Johnson, of course one thinks about the Vietnam War and all the anguish that that brought. And of course it's tempting for some to draw parallels between Vietnam and Afghanistan. But I want to say at the beginning that in my government's view, in my view, that is a temptation we should resist. These do feel like very different times in so many ways, not least because in Afghanistan, your country and mine are fighting as part of a huge international coalition with over 40 countries with personnel on the ground, and the Taliban simply do not have the support of the Afghan population. Now, why are we there? The war in Afghanistan and the related challenges we face across the border in Pakistan constitute, for my government, our top foreign policy and national security priority. And the reason is simple. Like your government, we believe that we have to prevent Afghanistan from becoming once again a safe haven for al-Qaeda and for international terrorists who plan to do us harm. After several reviews, your administration here, the British government in London, have concluded that we can do that by helping and supporting the government of Afghanistan to secure its own territory against militancy and terrorism. And that requires a comprehensive and politically led counterinsurgency campaign. Simultaneously, in Pakistan, we need to support the government's efforts, certainly through intelligence and security help, but also through economic and social development and the long-term nurturing of Pakistan's fragile political institutions. The task in Afghanistan remains extremely resource-intensive because the government there is that much weaker. The international coalition, ISAF, is still providing a huge number of military forces. After the surge is fully deployed in July, as you know, there will be around 135,000 international troops in Afghanistan. Now, when President Obama announced that surge in December, he said that the troops would be dedicated to three things: targeting the insurgency, securing key population centers, and training Afghan security forces. And General McChrystal has directed that all ISAF troops should partner their Afghan counterparts at every level to achieve these aims, from combat patrols up to strategic and operational planning. Ultimately then, and this is one of the key outcomes of the recent London conference on Afghanistan that was mentioned earlier, ultimately we want to create the conditions for transition to Afghan control. And that's why we have an emphasis in our strategy on training up the Afghan national security forces, and we have an agreement on a plan to transfer progressively, province by province, the lead security responsibility from ISAF, from NATO, to the Afghans themselves. And while we want to do that as quickly as possible, we can't start until the Afghans themselves are ready to take on that responsibility. Now, the conference in London did agree actual targets for building up these forces, so that a target of 171,000 troops for the Afghan army and 134,000 for the Afghan police to be recruited and trained by October 2011, with the aim of the first of Afghanistan's 34 provinces to be transferred to their control by the end of this year. So I don't for one moment underestimate the scale of the military task ahead this year, both in training and in the combat role, the intense combat role which our forces are going to undertake. But what I want to talk about today is not actually just about the military input. Our leaders have often said that there's no purely military solution to Afghanistan's problems, and the London conference brought together over 70 countries and international organizations like the UN, EU, and NATO to agree and lend their support to that political strategy that has to complement the military campaign. Now, the key for this political strategy, as for the military strategy, is that it has to place the Afghans themselves in the lead. President Karzai in London talked about Afghan leadership, Afghan ownership, and all of our action in the international community, both civilian and military, has to be in support of that. And we need to keep in mind that the best people to maintain security in Afghanistan and to prevent al-Qaeda from returning are the Afghans themselves. When the Taliban were in power, they broke Afghan society so badly that it was easy for al-Qaeda to take root. So our task is to help the Afghan people strengthen themselves and their society to the extent that they're robust enough to be able to repel al-Qaeda without the need for tens of thousands of our troops. So with that as the backdrop, I just want to talk about three elements of that political strategy, 3 R's. A reassurance for the Afghan people, reintegration of those fighting for the insurgency at the moment, and the regional outreach which we need to those around Afghanistan. Reassurance is about engaging the aspirations and the loyalties of the Afghan people themselves in defense of their own interests against the Taliban. So we're not just focused on making Afghans feel safer in their beds at night. We need the people of Afghanistan to want to take ownership of the future of their country. Opinion polls consistently tell us that only around 6% of the Afghan people want the Taliban back in power. But the evidence is clear that many more than that are unwilling to turn their back on the insurgency in case the Taliban do return. So we need to build up their trust in a government which is seen by them to be acting against corruption and aiming to govern competently. In the words of the British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, the Taliban need to be outgoverned, not just outgunned. And this part of the political strategy is designed to build up the capacity, the effectiveness, the credibility of Afghanistan's government. And that's going to be difficult, both in Kabul and in the provinces and districts of Afghanistan. And that means training and equipping provincial and district governors, distributing aid money more effectively, and addressing the deficit in justice by providing both financial and practical support. Afghanistan's local and provincial governance is chronically weak, and it's important because Afghanistan doesn't naturally have a strong federal structure, a strong federal core. So you have to look at what happens further down at the provincial and district level. Less than a quarter of the 364 district governors have electricity in their offices. Some receive only $6 a month in expenses. Often they have few, if any, competent staff to support them. So the London conference agreed that we need to be thinking about 12,000 additional subnational civilian staff who need to be trained and need to be supported so that they can provide those roles. And in addition, it is essential to take measures to tackle corruption. President Karzai has committed himself to making this a top priority of his second term, and the London conference agreed that there should be an independent office of high oversight and an independent monitoring and evaluation mission to be established, and a great deal of work is going to be needed on that. As on economic growth and employment creation, those are critical to reassuring the Afghan population that they should support the Afghan government rather than the Taliban. And the London conference agreed that Afghanistan will be provided with up to $1.6 billion in debt relief from major creditors, and the conference provided a platform for the Afghan finance minister to present his economic development plan, the focus of which was agriculture, infrastructure, and the development of human resources. And lastly, we agreed that as much as possible of our international development assistance would be channeled through the Afghan government system itself. The British government's been doing this for years, and it now channels about 50% of our aid that way. and we'd like other donors to do the same. It's the most effective way of spending the money. These efforts demand a great deal of international coordination. We now have new UN and NATO senior civilian appointees. The EU is going to announce its own new senior representative there. And the job of all these representatives in Kabul is to bring greater coherence to the international civilian effort. Too often, military and civilian programs have not been planned together, and some provinces have had more access to money than others. So for our strategy to work, we've all got to be marching to the same tune. Now, reintegration. It's a difficult subject. President Obama said last March, there is an uncompromising core of the Taliban. They must be met with force and they must be defeated. But there are also those who've taken up arms because of coercion or simply for a price. These Afghans must have the option to choose a different course. Now, top of President Karzai's agenda in his speech in London 2 weeks ago was the formation of a Peace, Reconciliation and Reintegration Commission to take forward that work on reintegration, which means splitting off the foot soldiers away from the insurgency. And that requires a combination of military pressure on the one side and political and economic opportunity. And like the strategy as a whole, as I've said, it's got to be led by the Afghans themselves, but supported by us, by the international community. Now, of course, the incentives we're offering have to be conditional. As President Karzai said in his inauguration speech, we welcome and will provide necessary help to all disenchanted compatriots who are willing to return to their homes, live peacefully, and accept the Constitution. The international community has strongly supported that effort, and we've put already $140 million into a new international trust fund for reintegration, which we hope, we the UK government hope, will reach up to 500 million over the next 5 years. And the aim of that fund is to be able to offer a better deal to the individuals who currently feel they have no option but to fight on the side of the insurgency for a few days or a few weeks or whatever. So by splitting or dismantling the insurgency in this way, along with the pressure that the insurgency will feel because of our increased military operations this year and by the existence of more effective Afghan forces, we will be able to move to a time when Afghanistan can stand on its own 2 feet. Now, reintegration is only one of the building blocks that will pave the way for the government of Afghanistan eventually to reconcile the more senior elements of the insurgency. And it's a feature of any civil conflict of this kind that in the end, people who have fought each other have to be brought together in a political process. And we've already seen this to some degree in Afghanistan. There are people now within the Afghan political system who were responsible for some dreadful acts during the civil war which followed the withdrawal of the Soviet Union. But these people have reconciled themselves to the Constitution, and they now serve under or live under President Karzai's government. So we have to create the conditions for more people fighting in the insurgency to do the same in due course. Such a process is inevitably going to take time, and it will only happen when it's in the interests of the insurgents and seem to be to stop fighting. And there's never one simple policy which forces those interests to change and the insurgents to reconcile. It's the whole range of pressures and incentives which will deliver this outcome. My third R is regional outreach. We need to develop a new consensus within the region that Afghanistan's future lies in being an independent sovereign state, the client of none and the friend to all. Pakistan, Iran, and others in the region are all affected by the crime, drugs, and terrorism that spills over Afghanistan's borders. A stable Pakistan is very much in their interests. But the trust deficit within the region means that the countries affected have maintained a hedging strategy at best for years. Now, we do need to change that and encourage a sense of regional ownership and involvement. Pakistan, given its ethnic and other connections with Afghanistan, has a particularly important part to play. And we've long said that we can't address Afghanistan's problems seriously without taking Pakistan fully into account. Recent Pakistan military efforts against the militants in the border areas have been welcome, but we need them to continue broadening their attention to al-Qaeda's leadership and the Afghan Taliban. And the Afghan Taliban can unfortunately still find funding, support and shelter on the Pakistani side of the border. So partnership is key. We need to work with Pakistan's democratic and security institutions to help them address these issues. The British and American governments played a leading role last year in setting up internationally the Friends of Democratic Pakistan group, which is designed to support Pakistan both politically and economically. Encouraging Pakistan to take the sort of serious counterinsurgency action they've done in the border areas is a part of this, but it needs to be followed up with timely and well-resourced development assistance in the education, health and infrastructure areas. And my government, the British government, has focused on education. And there's a senior representative of our Prime Minister who now co-chairs a joint UK-Pakistan education task force, which is looking at enhancing Pakistan's ability to provide basic education to young people who might otherwise fall only too easily under the influence of radical Islamic teachers. Now, there's a particular reason and motive for the UK in all this, given the strong links between the UK and Pakistan. There are about 800,000 Britons of Pakistani origin in the UK, and of course the vast majority of them are perfectly law-abiding, but a tiny number are regrettably involved in terrorism. And their background means that they can more easily reach back to this troubled part of the world, with the result that 2/3 of the terrorist plots that we know about, that we've identified and dealt with in Britain, have some origin in Pakistan. So we have to put a huge amount of effort and money into this, into addressing all the factors that contribute to that radicalization. Pakistan will soon be the recipient of our second largest aid program in the world. And we also deal under our counter-radicalization strategy, which is known as PREVENT, with the Muslim community in the UK in order to increase their resistance to violent extremism. So in conclusion, 2010 is going to be a very big year for all of us in Afghanistan. We need to work to implement the strategy we agreed last year. We need to maintain our resolve. We need to remember that fundamental principle that the Afghans have got to stay in the lead because it is their country. In supporting them, we aim to turn the tide against the insurgency by the middle of 2011. And both our governments hope that by then we'll have begun handing over provinces to Afghan security control, although it will clearly take much longer for all of them to be handed over. And even if Afghanistan's security forces and trainers are stronger and more robust by then, it will take longer for good governance to be embedded and for the economy to make progress which is self-sustaining. So we need, in the year or so ahead, that combination of urgency, because none of our publics will allow a long-term combat deployment at this scale, on the one hand, but also that lasting political and economic commitment. Thank you very much.
As the questions begin to be assembled, I'm going to grab the privilege of the moderator to ask a couple of questions. Sir Nigel, there was coverage in the media, sometime in the last week or two, that said that only about 7% of the prospective both military and police officials were literate. Can you talk a little to us about the challenge, meeting that challenge?
Well, it's huge, and I don't know whether that is the right number. I'm sure it's not fundamentally wrong. I'm sure it's not 97%, but I don't know whether it's exactly right. What it shows is the importance of the economic and social side of what we're doing in any event. And of course, a huge effort has been put into girls' education in Afghanistan, which has been a relative success story actually in the last 5, 6, 7 years. But I think this shows only too clearly the relationship between the economic and social effort on the one hand and the security effort on the other. One big issue, which I didn't cover in the speech but could have done, is counter-narcotics. That also requires parallel activity. Of course, you need to interdict the drugs, the supply and the production of drugs. Of course, you need to provide alternative livelihoods for people using development money. But you also need a functioning justice and prison system to deal with people who you do apprehend. So you need to think long term and deal with the structure as well. So in Afghanistan, you're dealing with a society at a very low level of development. It's a very poor country, an underdeveloped country. A lot of people have returned. Not enough have returned. You've got a large Afghan community in this country. It would be nice to see some of them gradually returning as Afghanistan becomes more successful. So you do have a big skills deficit, and that will only change over time. But I think there are efforts being made, and I'm not the expert on it, and there are some experts potentially, I think, in the audience. But I think that efforts are being made to provide basic literacy training, even as part of the overall security training which is being given to the police and the army. So you just have to fold that into the training program and framework that you're operating.
I was particularly taken with your emphasis on the need for political and economic activity from many of the partners, but also was struck there is a structure for the military campaign and the commander and the rest of it. How are the activities of all these multiple donors and countries going to be coordinated and hopefully effectively implemented in
Well, the short answer is we hope a bit better than it has been. And of course, you point to a real problem. I mean, there will be 135,000 troops who are organized, who can deliver the campaign which General McChrystal has devised. And we know that when your military and our military are given a task, they go about it with huge professional skill and courage, and will get it done. It's much more difficult on the civilian side, partly because the security is so bad in parts of the country that it's difficult to do a normal civilian role of providing aid or teaching in a school or whatever, because you need such a ring of steel around you. You need a high level of security simply to keep going and to survive. So these are not normal conditions in which to achieve political and economic effect. But that's what we've got to do. Your country has put in now about 900 civilian staff into Afghanistan, in Kabul and around the country. That's an enormous surge in itself. We have got about 100 people in Helmand alone, civilians working in the provincial capital, Lashkargah. That's a huge effort for the UK to have got that number there and operating effectively side by side in a coordinated way with the UK Army based in Helmand. So the numbers are going in, but even at those levels, it's obvious they're dwarfed by the military presence, and we have to recognise that. There has to be, as I was saying before, much better coordination. I think the UN has the lion's share of the responsibility for ensuring coordination between the different aid agencies. But I think this the newly enhanced role of NATO civilian representative, which is going to be done by a British diplomat, is going to be very important in getting that interface right between the military side of NATO and the civilian effort that we're all putting in, particularly on an area like reintegration, what I was talking about. Pulling those foot soldiers across is going to require a very, very subtle and combined military and political operation.
Just as a demonstration of how gentle our questioners are for you, the first one that pops up speaks of a recent debate where the topic was resolved: the Karzai government is not worth fighting for. Given especially the demonstrated fraud in recent elections, what's your view?
Well, I think I was trying to allude to the fact that we need the Afghan government to step up. The London conference provided them with a sort of deadline by which they needed to have a basic economic plan and a basic offer to their own people and to the international community on the table. We know what the problems are. We've all dealt with President Karzai for a number of years now, and we know his strengths and we know his weaknesses. But in the end, there's only one president of Afghanistan, and we don't have a choice over about which one to deal with. He is the president, and we have to find ways of strengthening him within his own system in realistic ways to enable him to come across as credible. But I think this is what the president was getting at, and what our government and others have been getting at, by trying to make clear that our involvement, that our patience is not unlimited. We've got to get across, as I was trying to say at the end of my remarks, we've got to inject that sense of urgency so that the Afghans feel the need to step up and take that responsibility if they possibly can in these appallingly hard circumstances. We've got to inject that urgency into it because we can't be there at these levels facing these risks for 10, 20 years. It's got to be done over a relatively short period if we're to be successful, and if they're to be successful, because it's not as though the situation there is calm and stable, and if it were just the status quo, it would be a gently rising and improving situation, rather the opposite. I think our feeling was last year that things were going backwards and that we needed an injection of military and political momentum to get things moving again. So I would say you've got to support Karzai. You've got to do it in a way which tries to get him to take responsibility, to take action on corruption, to be an effective leader for all Afghanistan, to be more visible as a leader. And I think he has made a reasonable start. But it's going to require a huge amount of effort to support him in the right way, and that requires General McChrystal and all the senior people to work with him in a sort of tough love is what's needed. There
is a parallel question, but different handwriting, so it's clearly not the same individual. Given all of Karzai's problems, minority status, corrupt brother, rigged election, Afghanistan being the world's #1 heroin supplier, would it not be prudent to negotiate directly with the Taliban to achieve our #1 goal, the denial of al-Qaeda safe havens?
Well, I think that it's difficult for us to negotiate with al-Qaeda, but I think that, as I've been trying to say, that we need to encourage that process within Afghanistan. We don't want to be the ones sharing power in some future time with our past enemies. We want to be able to leave the country with our military task done in a few years' time and continue, as I was saying, our long-term economic and social support effort. That's our ideal outcome in this. It's not to be there indefinitely. So I'm not attracted by us becoming part of the negotiating team and being part of the political solution. And I don't think that would be acceptable in any event to anyone, nor very appealing to the Taliban, I would have thought. But you do have to encourage it and not stand back from it. It's always difficult, that point when you are having to deal with people who are still causing you harm on the battlefield and who still wish us harm and are out there in propaganda terms every day causing a great deal of mayhem and difficulty. But if you look to other situations in the world, it's only by taking that step at the right moment, usually at a moment when they feel under military pressure, that you're able to get to a better position politically. I know it's not a very exact or precise parallel, but we had some good news in Northern Ireland last week with a final stage in the in the negotiated peace process there. Who would have thought that 20 years ago when I was last in Washington in the 1980s when I dealt with Northern Ireland as a subject and how difficult that was. We've reached the final stage of that, but there was a critical point in the 1990s where it was incredibly hard for people in Northern Ireland and for people in the rest of the UK to believe that it was possible to be reconciled to people on the far edge of the Republican movement or the far edge of some of the Protestant paramilitary organizations. But it had to happen. And now you see this extraordinary picture of Sinn Féin sharing power with the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. So it's not an exact parallel. It can't be. And there were no suicide bombers in Northern Ireland, thank God. But different calculus. But some of the same principles apply in dealing with this sort of situation.
You've already touched on this a couple of times, but back, for instance, who is our enemy in Afghanistan?
Well, our ultimate enemy in Afghanistan is really Al-Qaeda. I think our strategic requirement is to prevent Al-Qaeda or indeed any other organized terrorist group from having relatively free rein there, being able to act with impunity and do what they did before 9/11, establish a base from which complex international terrorist plots can be hatched. And that's a legitimate security interest for your country, for my country, for the foreseeable future. We're going to be the objects of those plots. So I think it's only natural that we should want to defend ourselves against them, not on our goal line, but further upfield and in the theatre in which these threats arise. The Taliban are our enemy at the moment, by definition, because I think Bob Gates said a couple of weeks ago, they are also part of the fabric of Afghan society, and we have to understand that and try to peel as many of them away and bring them into the mainstream, and therefore isolate and reduce that irreconcilable core that President Obama was talking about.
Related, is counterinsurgency still a viable option for British and U.S. troops in Afghanistan?
Well, we had this big debate last year. This was what General McChrystal put forward very clearly. Counterinsurgency compared with counterterrorism, I suppose, is the simplistic choice before us. Counterterrorism really relies on the application of military force without a sense of a countervailing, accompanying political strategy, and it assumes that the people you're targeting need to be and can be defeated, and that essentially is the be-all and end-all of that activity. Counterinsurgency assumes you're dealing with a much more broadly based movement containing very strong elements of terrorism, but also political and social alienation and grievance, which needs to be handled in a different way. And you transfer your objectives more to protecting the legitimate parts of the population, winning the population over ultimately through hearts and minds, as well as uncompromising military operations against those who are involved directly in the violence. So it's a more comprehensive, a more subtle approach. And to be honest, I mean, the UK government has always seen Afghanistan in that way. So for us, that debate that was going on here last year was not really in doubt. And if you were to go down a different route of essentially trying to do this, from a distance, using some of your, very high-tech capabilities, I think you would find it very difficult to win that hearts and minds battle, which is at the bottom of this.
And beginning to move just a little more broadly, what is your assessment of the threat of the jihadist movement over the next 10 years? That clearly is not limited just to Afghanistan.
Well, unfortunately, it's going to continue, I think, over that period to be a real threat to us. It's proved already over the past 10 years an ability to mutate, an ability to, well, first of all, to continue to be active in smaller numbers, and despite great military pressure in its headquarters, in the core. Headquarters is rather a misnomer, but I mean in its base in the Afghan-Pakistan mountainous border areas. But for all the effort that's been put in, we haven't stopped that planning core from being able to operate in the Pakistani tribal areas. So number one, they're still there. But the worldwide movement which has developed is one in which you get occasional impulses, this franchise system, occasional impulses from the center out to Yemen or Somalia or North Africa. And these operations can get along pretty well without a huge amount of direct support from the Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan. And I would have thought that sort of model, that sort of franchised effort, is likely to continue. And we're going to have to give more effort, and your country's already doing it, and mine as well, to Yemen and Somalia in the period ahead. Although I'm not sure it's in any way inevitable that the core of Al-Qaeda is going to be able to move, from Pakistan to either of those places. I think that's a long leap from where we are today. But I fear that over this period we're going to be facing this threat, and probably not fundamentally differently from the way it appears today.
Next question relates to the absence of a model government of the kind that one might want to see in Afghanistan for the Afghan people to recognize, to identify with. I have a question, isn't it almost an abstraction for the common Afghanistan population to even comprehend the kind of government we're trying to build?
It depends what our objectives are, and I think that President Obama, our government, other NATO governments have been quite careful not to pretend that we either can or should try to build Jeffersonian democracy, Westminster democracy in Afghanistan. It's not going to be that way. It's going to be much more rough and ready, and we have to accept that. It can be a more effective and credible government than the government that we've seen. And sometimes things can turn and can develop for the better. If you think back to the situation in Iraq, only, say, 4 years ago, at the depths of the sectarian violence in Iraq in 2006, leading up to the formation of the Maliki government in the spring of that year, we were all in despair about the levels of violence. And certainly in government, and I think outside government as well, you often heard the question, where's the Iraqi Karzai? Because in those days, we thought Karzai was a relatively effective and attractive leader. As it happened, partly because of the surge, partly because the Iraqi government under Maliki did find its feet and did find itself able to exercise real political power, the political vacuum got filled, at least partly. So things developed there in a way that I think the majority of people, commentators in this country and in Europe, probably would have found surprising in 2006 and 2007. So things can turn out with this combined political and military effort. All I'd say is, as we look at Afghanistan, we've got to be aware the whole time of the realities and the limitations. We need to build the minimum necessary structure at the center to avoid a vacuum recurring. But we also got to recognize that Afghanistan is a very poor society and a tribal and devolved political country. So we mustn't pretend that we can build a very, very strong federal government in Kabul. It's just enough to get us through and to make sure that the country holds together. Otherwise, it's power at the provincial level and power exercised informally through their tribal society.
Which takes us to, this is likely from a historian. What is the difference between our goals today and the great game of the 19th century? What's the parallels? What's different?
Well, I think that if it were just the great game of the 19th century, I don't think there'll be any chance of garnering public support for what we're doing. The only way that we can justify today the risks to our military, the risks to our civilians, is that if we don't do this, a worse direct threat exists to our homelands. I think that unless you can make that case, and it's believed, it's not worth losing lives for in Afghanistan. So it can't just be for some abstract balance of power or for some economic motive. It's got to be because this part of the world, if it goes further wrong, will represent a mortal threat to our security and prosperity. And that's the case, I think, that our government's been, our government and other NATO governments have been trying to make, and we're convinced of it, and we have to try and get that across. But I don't think it's great game stuff. And Afghanistan itself is a country of 30 million people. It's very poor. It does have some minerals and some things of that kind, which I know the Chinese are very interested in. But if it weren't for Al-Qaeda, if it weren't for the events before, leading up to 9/11, we wouldn't be there like this. And indeed, we weren't there. I mean, one of the problems is that in the years after the Soviet occupation, no one was very interested, and the place did decline and did return to an even more feudal society than it had been.
I'm going to inject two questions that are sort of related to this topic before we broaden away from Afghanistan. First, what potential role, assistance, could we foresee in what we're trying to do in Afghanistan from Russia, from China, from India?
Well, India is difficult because if India becomes too involved, then that raises hackles and suspicions in Pakistan. So India is involved. They have a lot of people on the ground. They're helping a lot, actually, with infrastructure, with road building and so on. But I think maybe too overt a political or certainly a security role would be destabilizing. And I think they're very conscious of that. Ditto Russia. I mean, given their recent history, it's difficult for them to be too overtly involved. We would like them to help more with the framework. They are very keen to help on counter-narcotics because they're also affected badly by the trafficking in drugs. But I think they can help more with the framework. I think probably the most important in the medium term of the three that you mentioned is probably China. And I'd say partly that some of their economic wealth might be used profitably in Afghanistan, and not just doing contracts for minerals, which they're good at. But they have a very close relationship with Pakistan and have done for 30 years now. It's not clear whether they are using that to try to help the Pakistani government down the path I've been talking about today. Are they helping them in their fight against extremism? Are they putting economic help their way that can help with education or with public works projects or whatever? I just don't have a sense of that. So they've got this very close relationship, which was built up at a time when Russia and India were paired together, and so China and Pakistan, by definition, had to be close. But times have changed. India has a new set of strategic relationships. And China really ought to be working much more closely with us if China were prepared to be the intelligent and responsible stakeholder we all want to try to work in the same direction as us in Pakistan.
Following on to that, I've been pretty pessimistic about the future of Pakistan. the fragility of the political situation and the relationship with the Army and the ISI, foremost. Where do you see this playing out?
Well, I'm not going to pretend that this is an easy one either, Admiral. So I think Pakistan, if we're looking at these two countries, we hyphenate them in a way because there's an interconnection between the two, Afghanistan and Pakistan. But the reality is the real strategic prize is Pakistan. Pakistan is a country of 180 million people. It's huge. It's a very young population. And Pakistan won't be stable if Afghanistan is a mess next door. And equally, Afghanistan won't be stable if Pakistan is seething and is able to provide so much support to the Taliban inside Afghanistan. So there's a mutual relationship. But let's be clear about the scale of the threat from Pakistan, and opportunity, but certainly the threat if Pakistan becomes more unstable. Now, what's likely to happen in Pakistan? There have been lots and lots of comments ever since President Zardari became president a year and a half ago that he was going to be removed tomorrow. Well, he hasn't been. I think it's actually in the interests of the military and the stated desire of General Kayani, who's the chief of staff, that they do not want to take over political power again. That is his objective after the Musharraf experience. He doesn't want the army to be put in that position again, in the near term anyway, in Pakistan. There's a possibility that their role as the unifying factor in Pakistan and as the one public institution which genuinely has public respect and esteem, that would be irreparably damaged if they were to take over again. So my sense is that they will find that the army would prefer not to do that. They'd prefer to see this fragile government continuing. There's a president who is not a trained politician, and he'd be the first to say this wasn't what he thought his life was leading to. But his wife was murdered, and he's taken over the reins, at least for a while. He's got a very effective prime minister, and he's got a number of very effective ministers. And the thing about Pakistan, which is an interesting fact about it, is that it does have a genuine civil society. It does have a functioning media. It does have a very vibrant media, actually. It has a functioning judicial system with a very independent judiciary. So it has much more about it in terms of institutional underpinning than a place like Afghanistan, which is much further back. So you're dealing with something in Pakistan, and you're dealing with certainly a tradition of administration and government, along with a history of military coups and instability and difficulty, which is the model they're trying to get away from, and we've got to try and support them on it. But this is why their task is so difficult, with that mixture of poverty, religious extremism, and the instability which comes from the security situation.
And as we move a little further out, it's a one-word question: Iran.
Thank you for that. I wish we could come on to something which allows me to speak optimistically about something. Well, Iran is also, I'd say, if we, it's never good to be too crude about these things, but Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran are, I think, the really top of our foreign policy agenda for this year, and the most troublesome and threatening issues that we're dealing with. And if Iran's nuclear program continues, and if they do acquire nuclear weapons, or on the brink of acquiring nuclear weapons, that would be extremely damaging and serious. It will provoke a regional arms race. It would certainly provoke an existential debate in Israel about how they should react, and so on. So the stakes couldn't really be higher. Last year, there were three really big events in and around Iran. There was a change of tack by your president with an offer of a different relationship, a hand offered to Iran, which hasn't been taken up. But it, I think, created a debate within Iran, and it certainly made an impact on the international community, who were inclined maybe before to think that the problem was in part on our side as well as on Iran's. And I think they now can see that the offer's been made to Iran, and it really is a problem on the Iranian side that is not enabling them to take up that offer of a better and more fruitful relationship. That was the first thing. I think it has changed the odds somewhat. The second was the elections and the aftermath of the elections in Iran and the repression which followed. I mean, that means that Iran is still racked by internal turmoil, and it's making it much more difficult for them to make decisions about the nuclear dossier and other aspects. But it also presents a picture of Iran which is very different from the one we saw before. What we'd seen before for a number of years was Iran on the rise, able to do no wrong regionally, able to manipulate things regionally. It looks a bit different today, as they've had to be humiliated in their region because of the extraordinarily violent measures they've had to take against their own population. It doesn't look as though things are quite as plain sailing for the Iranian regime as before. And the third thing was the announcement, our announcement, of the then secret facility in Iran, which was engaged in enrichment. And I think that exposed Iran. It was embarrassing for them. It helped again to build some international resolve. So those are the elements. I don't think they're all elements which make it, put it positively. Against that background, I would say we have to continue with our two-track approach. That offer needs to stay on the table. It doesn't look like it's going to be taken up for the time being. It doesn't look like they're capable of taking it up. So we need to continue with the other track, which is further pressure through sanctions, through political pressure, through uniting the international community as much as we can. They don't like that. They don't like the sanctions which have been adopted, and they won't like the future ones which we're thinking of. But to do that, we need as united a front in the international community as possible. And that comes back to a country we've talked about before. That's primarily to do with China and Russia, and particularly China at the moment, who've become, Russia is engaging in this debate. China is standing back at the moment rather more from it.
So and has become the number one trading partner of Iran.
They rely on them, and so they have to work out whether trade is a foreign policy or not when the stakes are so high internationally.
The next question was, do you expect Russia to play a more constructive role in Iran and Afghanistan? What inducements could encourage Russian cooperation?
I think we're already seeing the beginnings of that. It's early days. I think that the president and other members of President Obama's administration decided that they would go the extra mile last year in offering that resetting of relationship between the United States and Russia. The president went to Russia. He made a point of offering a relationship of respect and equality to President Medvedev. He didn't get a lot out of it instantly, but it wasn't ever designed to achieve that. It was designed to create in Russian minds the expectation that they'd be treated seriously internationally over the lifetime of this administration. And I think what the Russians want from it is a return to the framework of arms control and disarmament agreements, which they believe serves their interests. That is what I think is serving American interests, but they like to be negotiating the New START agreement and other agreements in the future, number one. They like the appearance of political respect from the United States. That's important to their psyche, given the last 20 years. And I think when it comes to Iran, that actually there's quite a lot of Russians who feel the threat quite intensely. I don't think they want a nuclear Iran run by a theocracy on their doorstep. And in the past, that has been balanced by their desire to destabilize the United States. Maybe that will be a less present desire today if they see the United States more as a partner. So those are the elements in the equation. The Russians are very hard-headed, as we know. They'll negotiate down to the wire on a UN resolution or whatever. But I think the sense of your diplomats and our sense as well is that on the Iran issue at the UN, they're prepared to engage on the issue, and they realize that we need to turn up the pressure in the present phase of our activity over Iran.
I apologize for having opened the door for other questions unrelated to your topic.
That's fine.
But having done it, now here we are. The UK historian Richard Evans recently wrote in the London Times that the Obama administration is not helping the long-time special relationship of Britain and the U.S. A symbolic example is the return of the bust of Churchill and ignoring Prime Minister Brown.
Well, Prime Minister Brown doesn't feel ignored. I must make that clear. I don't think you can measure things by things like the bust, which is neither here nor there. The bust of Winston Churchill was in the White House for, I think, 7 and a bit years during President George W. Bush's time there. It's not something which has been a fixture, for a generation or anything like that. So I don't think we feel any slight over that whatsoever. Our relationship, the UK-US relationship, does depend on a combination of interests and values and a very strong and intimate dialogue at the top. And I think we've got that. It's different from the past. When our Prime Minister first started talking to the newly elected President Obama, they were talking really about 2 issues. They were talking certainly about Afghanistan and Pakistan, but they're also talking principally about the crisis in the international economy and how to get their own economies back on their feet, because that was their preoccupation as politicians and has been over the past year and a quarter since President Obama's election. So the special relationship gets renewed and recreated for different people and for different times. And for our time, our cooperation in the setting up and our cooperation in the G20, the 2 summits under President Obama's time in London and in Pittsburgh, the work that we've done together on Afghanistan, they've required very, very close working between Gordon Brown and President Obama. So we feel we have a very, very close partnership over that range of issues. But the world is a more complicated world than it was. I think President Obama said this. The world's a more complicated world than the world that Roosevelt and Churchill presided over. It's not a world where any 2 countries can sit down and make a decision and their writ will run. It's much more complicated than that. But if you want a relationship which is based on values as well as interests, where another country's intelligence, military, diplomatic, economic ideas, assets are shared globally with the United States, then you won't have a stronger partner than the UK.
We have only about 5 minutes left. Can you comment on President Obama's decision to not attend the EU summit meeting scheduled for Spain?
Well, I'm going to be a bit controversial. At least I would be if there were any European colleagues of mine here, and really say 2 things. I mean, the first is that I'm sure President Obama will want, in his time in office, to work closely with the European Union. And the European Union finds it difficult to project power, to create a unity of purpose and a unity of presentation in what it does. And that's for obvious reasons. The European Union is a funny mixture of central authority and the power of our member states. And we as the UK wouldn't want it otherwise. We wouldn't want a single person as president of Europe because we know that our national institutions are much too important for that. So it has to be a balance, and therefore Europe comes across as looking to any outsider, even an informed one, rather complicated, with a lot of people in the room at any one time representing Europe. That's the way, folks, that I think it's going to be for quite some time. So we do find it difficult. We're going to make an extra effort. Now we've got a new treaty in the Lisbon Treaty under our belts. That'll give us an added impetus to project ourselves more effectively around the world, and I think we will, in a quiet way, improve our performance qua EU. around the world, or I think the key foreign policy actors will remain the UK, France, and Germany working together. But my second thing is, and I hope this isn't offensive to any representatives of the Spanish government here, the president's got to prioritise his time. And the time that was set aside for the EU-US summit was a time when the president wasn't planning to visit Europe. And we know the pressures that the president and indeed a huge number of other leaders around the world are under, really to pay attention to their domestic politics. So I have some sympathy with the fact that he hasn't gone this time. I think the EU will do well to move to annual summits between the EU and the United States, and not to expect the president to do this twice a year. We're doing this twice a year at the moment because until now we've had a 6-monthly chairmanship, rotating chairmanship of the European Union, which means that each president wants his share of the limelight with the President of the United States. Now we've reduced the role of the presidency. We've got permanent chairs of our institutions, so that shouldn't be as big a deal. And I think if we move to one summit a year, I'm sure the US president, whoever it is, will show up, and that would be a good thing.
And proving that we follow domestic activity in the UK, will you be testifying before the UK Iraq War Commission?
The answer is possibly, but I've actually already done it once. I testified to this inquiry in December. I was, as we heard earlier, I was Prime Minister Blair's effectively national security advisor, starting just after the conflict in Iraq, starting in August of 2003 for 4 years. So I testified to our inquiry, which has been set up to learn the lessons of our involvement over the past 8 years. I testified to that in December, and it's possible I may need to testify again.
And the second part is clearly inclined to pull you into U.S. politics. Do you think such a commission is a worthwhile function?
Well, we'll see. I think it's too early to tell. That's an easy answer. I think it's a bit early. Our one won't report until the end of this year. I think we'll have to see what the report comes up with. As I say, it's not a court of law. It's not intended to pass judgment in that way. It's intended to try and learn some lessons which might apply to future decision-making and to future politicians and military leaders and so on approaching a similar set of problems. So we'll have to see. But I mean, I think I wouldn't like to make a recommendation as to what might happen here.
In gratitude to you for taking the time to come and be so candid with us, I simply want to underline the special relationship. I had the privilege of working inside that special relationship intensely for 8.5 years. It's not just having a common language or a common set of values, but it's the collaboration with a worldview on so many issues, the depth of cooperation in the intelligence world, which I think has been critical for both sides, for many of the advances we made, as well as in the defense arena. So let the critics say what they want. Long live the special relationship. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.